Did you know Toronto has a shoreline that's hidden right beneath our feet? Most people have no idea, but the clues are still here. I'm Meg.
And I'm Faith, and today we're following new Heritage Toronto plaques along Front Street to uncover the hidden stories buried beneath Toronto's natural shoreline.
Let's dig into it.
Take a look at Toronto's waterfront. The parks, the condos, the boardwalk, even the shoreline itself. This is how people picture Toronto's famous waterfront. But almost everything you're looking at is built on land that wasn't here over 200 years ago. Back then, the harbor was located just below Front Street, so called because it fronted the harbor. So what happened to it?
Today, most traces of that shoreline are gone, but under Front Street and nearby, archaeologists have discovered artifacts that link to the early shoreline and tell us more about that story. Some of those discoveries are actually featured on 12 Heritage Toronto plaques installed from Yonge and Front Street to Hahn Place in the Esplanade. They provide clues on what life would have been like on the early shoreline, who lived there, what they built, what they bought, and what they fought for.
To understand how the natural shoreline disappeared, we need to start long before there was a Toronto. Before there were streets, railways, or wharves, this shoreline was part of a landscape that was used and cared for by Indigenous peoples. In 1908, workers digging a tunnel near Hamlet's Point accidentally discovered footprints that were preserved in clay and later covered by Lake Ontario. Between 10 and 13,000 years ago, these footprints were left behind by Indigenous peoples. They were wearing moccasins, possibly similar to the ones on this plaque, as they walked along the shoreline. It's one of the oldest pieces of evidence for human activity ever discovered in the Toronto area, and these footprints are a reminder that Indigenous history here stretches back thousands of years.
But these ancient footprints are far from the only evidence we have of Indigenous life on this land. This plaque shows how they lived here. Among the artifacts found along the shoreline were beads made out of stone, metal, glass, and even shell. Small objects, but they tell a much larger story. Indigenous peoples have long established communities and built homes here. One of the best known examples of this is the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee that described the land as something to be shared and cared for rather than owned. At ceremonies where these treaties were created, Indigenous peoples exchanged wampum belts made out of these carefully crafted beads to symbolize their relationship and promise to each nation. These beads remind us that before European settlement, the shoreline hosted a long-established culture. So, what happened when British officials arrived with a very different idea on what land ownership meant? By the late 1700s, Britain wanted to establish a permanent settlement along the north shore of Lake Ontario. In 1787, they signed what would be known as the Toronto Purchase with the Mississaugas of Western Lake Ontario, whose traditional territory covered the Toronto area. The treaty covered over 250,000 acres, but both sides understood it very differently. The Mississaugas thought they were sharing access to the land while still maintaining their traditional treaty rights, while the British saw it more as a permanent purchase and transferring ownership. The difference in understanding between these two groups would shape the future of our shoreline for generations.
A few years later, in 1793, Lieutenant Governor John Gray Simcoe established the town of York, now Toronto, and that location wasn't chosen by chance. The natural harbor provided protection, access to the Great Lakes, and was an ideal place for trade and military defense. This black ship's compass is a reminder of that moment. We don't know who owned this particular compass, but tools like these were used by colonists to survey the land, navigate these waters, and to develop some of the earliest maps of York. We use these maps to trace the natural shoreline and to figure out where these plaques would be located. This compass is not the only evidence of colonial settlement. In multiple locations across the shoreline, shell buttons like these were found. What we do know is that they most likely came from a shirt or a coat and had dropped off and disappeared into the mud nearly 2 centuries ago. What we also know is that by the mid-1800s, shell buttons made of mother of pearl or mollusk had become fashionable across the British Empire. These natural resources were extracted from waterways from around the world and shipped to industrial centers like Birmingham, England. From there, they were manufactured into buttons and shipped again to growing colonial cities like Toronto. Even something as seemingly simple as a shell button indicates how deeply the shoreline was connecting Toronto to growing global trade networks.
And as more settlers, businesses, and goods arrived, it began to outgrow the narrow, long strip along the harbor. So while the shoreline was helping the city grow, it was also becoming one of its biggest limitations. Today, Meridian's Hall stands where Toronto's harbour used to be. In 1832, Peter Freeland bought a water lot right here and built a soap and candle factory. Less than a decade later, he helped found the Yonge Street Wharf Company. The deed for that settlement, found right here and signed in 1841, outlines the rules and operation of this wharf. On paper, it was a business document. In practice, it changed the waterfront into a gateway for the movement of money, goods, and materials. Wharves stretched into the lake, warehouses followed, industrial buildings boomed along the shoreline, and piece by piece, Toronto started filling in land where water used to be, which helped the city thrive, but also connected Toronto to a growing imperial economy. Factories like Freeland used palm oil for their soaps and candle baking, which is largely tied to colonial exploitation and trade networks in West and Central Africa. And that imperial economy we're talking about, that's the growing British Empire.
But behind the wharves, factories, and expanding trade networks were the people living and working in the city that grew around them. And not everyone experienced that growth in the same way. In 19th century Toronto, many people lived ordinary lives, trying to make a living in a rapidly expanding city. One of Toronto's earliest red light districts was actually located near the waterfront. As ships arrived, so did sailors, laborers, merchants, and travelers, creating a demand for sex work in the growing town. For much of the 19th century, officials often tolerated brothels, believing that they supported the economy and even protected public health. The brightly colored stockings, like you see in this plaque here, were more than a fashion statement. Sex workers wore them to catch the attention of potential clients, flashing their ankles as a subtle invitation. For many women, sex work was one of the few ways to gain enough money to provide for themselves, support their families, or gain a measure of financial independence in a society that offered them few opportunities.
For many people trying to survive in the city, Toronto's early institutions offered more punishment than support. This ceramic sherd was found at the former site of the Home District Jail, which is also known as the former site of the first Parliament building. Many of the people held at the jail were awaiting trial, owing money, adults and children convicted of minor offenses, or those that the Victorian society deemed as mentally ill. Many of the people here were experiencing poverty, addiction, homelessness, mental illness, and circumstances that society had few things in place to support. It would take many decades before the Ontario justice system was reformed, and over a century before the first welfare system was in place.
But the inequalities in 19th century Toronto were not accepted without challenge, and one of the people who confronted them was Mary Ann Shedd Carey, and this piece of metal, called a type block, helps tell her story. In 1853, Mary Ann Shedd Carey founded the Provincial Freeman, an anti-slavery newspaper that moved to Toronto in 1854, and it was one of the most influential newspapers in Canadian history. With it, she became the first Black woman in North America to establish and edit a newspaper. Its pages advocated for Black freedom, education, women's rights, and the abolition of slavery at the time when these ideas faced enormous resistance. Every page was printed using blocks like these, which were covered in ink and stamped onto paper. Shedd's story also challenges a common misconception about Canada. While it's often remembered as a refuge to the Underground Railroad, slavery was also practiced here for more than 200 years. Enslaved people here endured torture and abuse while being forced into various forms of labor that made the industrialization of Toronto possible.
As Toronto industrialized, wharves and shipping routes created new opportunities along the waterfront for businesses to grow, like the Dalton Bros. By the late 1800s, the company was milling coffee, tea, spices, and other goods on the southwest corner of Princess Street and Front Street East. This tin looks ordinary, something you find in a pantry. But how did these spices get to Toronto when none of them grew near Lake Ontario? That story spans oceans. These goods traveled through trade networks shaped by the British Empire, plantation economies, and colonial extraction. Tea connected Britain with South and East Asia. Coffee and sugar were deeply tied to slave labor across the Atlantic world, and spices traveled through routes contested and controlled for centuries. By the time these products reached Toronto, they had already passed through the colonial systems of power that made everyday consumption possible. By the mid-1800s, spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger were all common and familiar in recipes like apple pie, and the Shoreline helped bring them here.
By now, Toronto's waterfront had already become the city's front door, and for generations, much of what arrived at the harbor ended up at St. Lawrence Market. The meat hooks, like you see here, were used to display fresh and cured meat at the market. The market itself was founded in 1803, and back then it sat directly on the shoreline. Now that wasn't a coincidence. Ships could unload their cargo directly into the market, where merchants sold everything from produce and livestock to imports from around the Great Lakes and beyond. The harbor and the market depended on each other. One brought people and goods into the city, the other distributed them. And as Toronto grew, so did St. Lawrence Market. Farmers traveled from across the region to sell their items here, but businesses clustered around the waterfront to take advantage of the constant flow of trade. Over the course of 2 centuries, Lake Ontario's natural shoreline disappeared between landfill, railways, roads, and skyscrapers until it became almost impossible to see. And when the shoreline became obscured, many of its stories disappeared along with it. But these plaques help make the history visible again.
So, the next time you're moving along Front Street, stop, read the plaques, and follow the path of stories about Toronto's natural shoreline throughout the city. And if you have any of your own stories about the shoreline, comment down below. Because while the shoreline may be buried, there's still many more stories to be uncovered.